While we're waiting, please help yourselves. If anybody would like juice, there's red wine and white wine, so the glasses on the table. Serve yourselves, grab a drink now. Would you like something, John?
I've got water, thanks. I'm good. Yeah, I'm fine. No, I'm fine. Yeah, sure.
I'm going to have some red wine. Would anybody else like red wine? No? It's nothing to do with experimental economics, Sean.
What, the wine?
It helps to go.
Okay. Yeah, this is live.
Good. All right. Well, let us get a start. I wanted to get a 5 o'clock start because we are live streaming the event, so we're trying to stick to the schedule. Sean, I don't think Sean Muller needs an introduction for most of you. He's one of the bright young stars at UG Economics, and recently has been a resident here at the Johannesburg Institute of Advanced Study, working on a book on experimental economics. Now, if one can use the term sexy without irony in speaking about economics, I think probably this would be one of the sexiest topics at the moment. Just won the Nobel Prize, of course, recently. But it isn't certainly a subject, I think it's fair to say, without controversy. It certainly has its critics. And I think it is getting so much hype. In a way, I think the economics profession has been very keen to make much, not only of the fact that they've sort of moved outside the canon with this particular Nobel Prize, as they have been doing in recent years, but of course that a woman was among the prize winners, because that's a rarity in economics. Well, it's a rarity in Nobel Prizes generally. So much has been made of this, but behind the hype, there are some certain questions that deserve to be asked, and Sean is important for those asking them. So he's going to speak to us for a while. Afterwards, we'll pass to a discussion, and we'll let people come in gradually and fill up the room. But when we do get to the question and answer, what I'll ask you to do is to sort of to try and keep the discussion turning over at a good pace. We'll try and keep the questions focused one at a time so that we can get the discussion going, and then we'll see how it flows from there. Okay. So, with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sean. Thank you, Sean, and we look forward to the presentation.
Great. Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody, for coming, and to those who are watching on the live stream. So, as John said, in some ways it's not a good thing that this is a sexy topic. Actually, we decided that I would give this seminar before the Nobel Prizes were announced. And although there had been quite a lot of hype that the proponents of randomized trials in economics would get the prize, I have to say I didn't think it would happen. At least not anytime soon. So it did catch me by surprise in that sense, but it's serendipitous because the seminar had already been planned. What I would also like to do, just as I start, is acknowledge the educationalists who I've spoken to over the years, some more than others, from whom I've learned a lot more about education in the South African education system than I've ever learned from reading papers in economics, despite being trained as an economist and an applied microeconometrician. So, in some sense, this presentation is about the political economy of economic research, and in particular economic research on basic education questions. The paper title, just to remind you, the provocative title, The New Colonial Missionaries, Basic Education Policy and Randomized Trials in South Africa, is partly inspired by a review by Pranab Bardhan in the Boston Review in 2013, where he referred to the proponents of randomized trials in economics, also known as the randomistas, and that's a term that I'll use as I go along, as possessing a kind of missionary zeal in the way that they approached the advocacy of their methods and the way that they engaged with other economists and society at large. So in South Africa, in fact, anecdotally, one education economist has said that if he weren't conducting education randomized control trials, he'd be planting new churches, which does have a remarkable resonance with Badan. It was actually for my PhD, which was on the use of randomized trials in economics. I started that in 2010 and finished it in 2014. And in particular, the use of randomized trials to inform policy. Okay, so there's a critical analysis of that. And then separately, I happened to be contacted by Oxfam in 2012 and asked to do some work on education funding in South Africa. They were actually much more interested in sort of micro-level resourcing questions, not at the macro level. So both on their side and on my side, because I've been trained by South African economists of education, we didn't really think that there were issues at the macro level. And I'll get to the reason for that later. But somewhat to my surprise, when I did the analysis, I actually came to the conclusion that, in fact, South African education was probably underfunded at the aggregate level nationally. And although that might not seem remarkable to educationalists and maybe even the general public, it very much goes contrary to the standard view amongst economists in South Africa and subsequently also policymakers who've been influenced by those economists. So this piece of work actually emerges out of these two strands of research, okay, and bringing them together. And the basic problem that I'm going to talk to arises from a combination of what I call dubious scientism in economics. So the notion basically that economics is a science in particular when it does experiments like scientists, randomized controlled trials, and the combination of that scientism, which has become increasingly dominant internationally, with a range of local factors. Okay, and particularly in the education context. So this gives you an overview of the structure of the argument. Basically, there are three broad factors that I'm going to talk to. The first is the limitations of randomized trials for policy in general, okay, with an emphasis on economics, although the concerns do apply to some other areas as well. The second is a flawed diagnosis of the problems with the South African education system. Okay? And that largely comes from local academics. And then the third is a missionary approach, what I call a missionary approach, by both international advocates of randomized trials and their local counterparts. So when you combine those three factors, you end up with what I suggest are misguided and harmful policies and practices, which is quite the contrary of what is promised. Because what's been promised by these practitioners is that actually randomized trials should help us make better policy. They should help us solve world poverty even. But what I'm going to suggest is that it leads to the opposite outcome. One thing so of these three factors, the one that I'm going to talk to least is the missionary approach. And one reason for that is because it's very hard to actually talk about the political economy of academics and academic economists in particular without being accused of making ad hominem attacks. And I have no desire to do that. And so in general, I'd like to avoid referring to particular individuals. But there is an interesting irony here, because economists generally have no qualms about casting a negative light on other people's motivations. Anecdotally, well not anecdotally, but one example, was a very famous paper by Bertrand, Mulainathan, and Miller. The punchline of that paper was basically, young black South African men are unemployed because they're lazy and they're sponging off their parents' and grandparents' social grants. Now, subsequently, that paper and the methodology associated with it, and other people watching, the nature of those claims is evidently problematic. But I just want to gesture at the tension that if one tries to raise similar concerns about the motives and the stance of economists, that's tolerated a lot less. Okay, so I'm a little cautious in that regard, and I won't be saying a lot about the missionary aspect per se. Also, just a note on references and reading. So I'm not going to be giving a lot of references, in fact, very few. But I can refer you to ones. So for example, the first chapter of my PhD, which was published as a working paper back in 2014, gives a very detailed overview on criticisms of randomized controlled trials, and in particular, their use for policy. Right? So that's available online. It's on the Salja website. The names of some important critics, some of you might recognize. Heckman, who won the Nobel Prize for econometrics, I think, in the early 1990s. Jeff Smith, Pranab Bardhan, who I've already mentioned. Angus Deaton, who won the Nobel Prize, I think it was in 2015. Michael Keane, Martin Revalian, Nancy Cartwright, who's a philosopher of science. So all of these individuals have made very important contributions to this debate, and if you're interested in looking up more detail, you can follow those names. As John mentioned, I'm writing a book, not actually Graduate School of Business, in the online publication Africa as a Country, and that's generated some fairly heated debate. So if you want a short overview of both the methodological and ethical concerns with randomized trials in economics, you can take a look at that. Okay, so just an aside also on issues of ethics and positionality. I'm not going to talk to that much because it's not my primary concern. But there are concerns about the nature of the relationships, really, between the practitioners of randomized trials in economics and local populations, right? So let me take one example. It's interesting because I tried to look it up recently and I couldn't find a published version. And maybe that's a good sign. Maybe that means that at some point a journal editor said, no, this study was actually unethical. But I know that the study was implemented. And it involved randomizing the allocation of, I think it was HIV clinics in Malawi. And when I say randomizing the location of, I mean they randomized by GPS coordinates. So that also meant sometimes that these clinics got just put in arbitrary places in the middle of the bush, right? And the idea was that you want to test the impact of distance on people accessing, for example, HIV treatment. How that got through an ethical approval process, I don't know. Because the argument that economists often make when it comes to randomized trials and ethical concerns is that you're giving people things that they wouldn't have anyway. So in the case of these clinics, you're giving people more clinics than they would have had. So even if some people don't get access to the clinics, which is one of the ethical concerns that's been expressed, some people will. So overall, it's an improvement. But that's not necessarily the case if you take into account the way in which these experiments are being conducted. And if you ask questions about agency. So I think a very important question, and there are a number of authors who've written about ethical concerns in relation to randomized trials, it's an ongoing debate in economics, is if these people weren't poor, right? Because remember that the Nobel Prize, as I'll show you just now, was awarded partly for efforts to tackle poverty using randomized trials. If these people weren't poor, would they consent to these kinds of experiments? I think in many cases the answer is no. So in that case, you're taking advantage of the situation which you actually claim to be intending to remedy. And with that, one sees visuals. One sees visuals of the white Western researcher, generally speaking, or perhaps the member of an elite upper class in the case of India. So they may both be Indian, but you've got lower caste people and higher caste people, and the higher caste people come in and they're experimenting on the lower caste people, or the white Western researcher who comes to African countries and experiments on poor people, notionally for their own benefit. Now, in social sciences outside of economics, there are well-established literatures on these problems. But economists in general tend to be quite myopic and quite resistant to this kind of reflection. So I'm not going to talk a lot about that, but I just want to acknowledge that those are there, and a number of people are writing very important criticisms based on these issues. Okay, so as John noted when we started out, the seminar happens to be even more relevant now than it would have been otherwise because of the Nobel Award that was announced towards the middle or end of last month, and I gather the prizes will be given at the beginning of December. And so the prize in economic sciences for 2019 was awarded to Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and Michael Kramer for their experimental approach to alleviating global poverty. And to quote the Nobel press release, their research is helping us fight poverty. That's the claim. Now, the interesting thing is, really? Is there any evidence of that? And it's an important question to ask because the argument in the Nobel Award and from the recipients themselves in their own particular institutional contexts is that they're making a difference to global poverty. And they're making a difference through advocating evidence-based policy, where that evidence-based policy is based on randomized trials. Okay? Now, a key tenet of that approach is to say we don't accept policy claims unless they've been verified, and the best form of verification is a randomized experiment. So now, should we not apply that standard to the very claim that these individuals are making and that the Nobel Committee is making? In other words, what evidence is there that countries using randomized trials to inform policy have developed any faster than other countries? What evidence is there that countries using randomized trials to inform policy have developed faster than they would have otherwise? Okay, so this is the question of the counterfactual. What would have happened had we done something else? And that's really important because one of the fundamental criticisms of this approach is, well, lots of countries have developed economically and socially without randomized trials. Yes, randomized part to see if it improves plant growth. But if you look at the history of development of currently developed countries, None of them relied on randomized trials in this way, and poverty was not eliminated through the targeted use of interventions based on randomized trials. So there's a burden of proof here on the so-called randomistas, which hasn't really been addressed. And I think the concern that I have, and I think that other people have with the phrasing of the award, so it's with the phrasing, it's not so much with the decision. Because if you look at the work that these authors have done, and other authors linked to them, it's clearly had a dramatic effect on economics as a discipline. And that makes for a very easy argument for the award, to say we're going to give the award to these economists because they've had such an important impact on the discipline, regardless of whether you agree with the propositions that lie behind that impact. But the problem with the Nobel Award is that it actually makes claims about a tangible impact on world poverty, and there's no evidence to support those claims. And personally, I don't think any such evidence ever will be provided, and certainly none that will hold up to critical scrutiny. Okay? So that's very important. So let me talk to the high-level dynamics of what's actually going on behind this award and that led to this award in economics. So this is an excerpt from an article from 2005 on Esther Duflo. And it says, Duflo has been a major force in bringing rigor, precision, and concreteness to randomized evaluations of policy and programs. People never used to do randomized evaluations. It was always referred to as the gold standard, but nobody actually did it. So this is the one dimension of it. It's the notion that there's a hierarchy of evidence. And at the top of that hierarchy are randomized trials. They're the gold standard. Everything else needs to aspire to that. So for example, you will find papers written by some of these authors that are not actually experimental in the sense that they were based on experiment, but they're quasi-experimental. So they might find some natural variation. A famous example is what's called Maimonides' rule in Israel, where you cap class sizes at 40 students per class. So that means that if you have a school that has, say, 82 students, then you have to have 3 classes, because you can't have a class that has more than 40 students, right? So you have this slightly arbitrary variation in class size, and you can use that as a sort of quasi-experiment to try and test the effect of, say, class sizes on test scores. Okay? So the idea is that randomized trials are the best, quasi-experiments second best, other forms of econometric analysis kind of below that, and everything that's non-quantitative, basically, economists just don't take seriously. At least they don't take it seriously when other people do it. Okay? And that's a point I'm going to get back to. So there have been many very cogent criticisms of this notion of evidence hierarchy, and many of these proponents of randomized trials have now backed off quite a lot. So now the view is, oh no, there's actually no such thing really as a gold standard. We have different kinds of evidence, and we think that in many situations, randomized trials are the best kinds of evidence we can get if they're available. But if you go back into the literature, you'll find that basically they were advocated as a gold standard. So that was in 2005. In 2010, there was a very interesting exchange, very important exchange, if you're interested in this literature, in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, between proponents of randomized trials and their critics, like Angus Deaton, for example. The most notable article in that series was this one by Angus and Pischke, in which they declare a credibility revolution in empirical economics. So basically what they're saying is the use of experimental and quasi-experimental methods brings credibility to economics. It's interesting to ask, okay, so what was happening before that? Because economists were definitely making policy recommendations, and I deal with that in some other work. I like to call it's a revolution without a history. So economists are right since the credibility revolution started, and we won't say anything about what they were doing before that. But if you look at these approaches, so you've got a gold standard, you've got a credibility revolution, and then in 2013 you've got Raj Chetty. So Esther Duflo, before she won the Nobel, she was awarded the Bates-Clark Medal for the best economist in the US under the age of 40. And these days that's considered a sort of marker of somebody who will in the future win the Nobel. Somebody else who's won the Bates-Clark Medal is Raj Chetty, and many people say they think he'll win the Nobel Prize. And he wrote this piece in the New York Times in 2013, where he said, yes, economics is a science. And the gist of the article, which you can go and read yourself, is economics is a science because we're doing experiments like scientists do. Now, people who are familiar with philosophy of science will realize this is not a very sophisticated argument, and there's lots of holes in it. I think it's been quite well addressed by people like Charles Mansky, and I've also written about it in some of my work. But when you bring these things together, you get this outcome in which the only way we can really credibly understand world poverty and how to address world poverty is through the use of randomized trials, preferably by economists. And this was a tweet by Bill Gates shortly after the Nobel Prize announcement. And what I really like also is the graphic, where you have these academics who basically are actually academic economists, and they're standing behind a microscope, and they're staring down at all these poor people. That's actually, I mean, that's what this image is representing. So we've got the scientists, and we've got the poor people, and the scientists are understanding these poor people much like they might understand microbes or anything else, and figuring out, presumably, how we can change their behavior and make them grow, I suppose. But what's really disconcerting is also the narrative. So Gates says that he's learned a lot from their pioneering work to better understand the complexities of the lives of the world's poorest people. That isn't really how randomized trials were framed in economics. And it's the kind of shape-shifting that I'll talk to a little bit later. But the original argument was that we need to credibly identify causal relationships. And if we identify those causal relationships, we can make policy based on those. Now, in response to a lot of criticism, this is now morphing to, well, and it has morphed over the years, to, well, we actually want to improve our understanding of the lives of poor people. Okay, but what about the anthropologists, the sociologists, the historians, all the other kinds of academics and intellectuals and even people within broader society who've been trying to understand the lives of the poor in different ways, right? So it's not as if the lives of the poor have not been the subject of a great deal of study, and including by economists using other methods. So why is this not just framed as just another method, which may or may not give us some insights into the lives of the poor, but is definitely not superior to other methods? Why? Because of the scientism, because of the notion that this is based on science. It's an experiment, it's scientific, and therefore it's more credible than any other approach. That doesn't stand up to much scrutiny, and a number of philosophers like Nancy Cartwright have written about that. So there's a vast range of problems with this approach, and I kind of catalog them in that 2014 working paper. But let me just state a few here for your benefit. Okay, so the first is that the claim to a gold standard has been shown to be misguided, not just in the broader context. So there's a philosopher's very nice paper which is titled, I think, and Edward Wittlisel have shown that there's nothing actually very special about the kinds of treatment effects you estimate with randomized trials. So you can lodge them within a broader framework, and they have strengths and limitations, just like any other econometric approach. A very important criticism from people like Angus Deaton and others is that the analogy that a lot of writers have used is if you lose your wallet or your purse, you're walking in the street, you go and look for it where there's the street light because you can see what's there, right? And so the argument is that randomized trials get us to do the same thing in the context of development. We're only going to ask the questions that we can run randomized trials about, and we're not going to ask the other questions. But there's no reason ex ante to believe that the questions that we can use randomized trials for are the ones that actually matter. And this is going to be important when I talk the African education case. Another concern is that randomized trials, particularly in their earlier versions, assume randomized trials don't let us learn meaningfully about the world. So you test an intervention, you find a positive result. You maybe get some estimate of the magnitude of that result. But you don't know why it actually worked. I'll talk about an example later, which I think was a very poor study in South Africa, where study guides were randomly allocated to students, and they find a positive result. And I said to the authors at the time, well, one hypothesis is that maybe the schools sold the study guides, and they bought biscuits for the students, and the biscuits improved student motivation. And that's why the scores went up. And they have no evidence to disprove that. Right? So you can make up stories as to why things work or they don't work. And that leads us back into the area of qualitative expertise, not quantitative scientific experiments. Another concern, which I'm also going to talk to later in this presentation, is that the use of these methods amplifies what I would say is a baseless hierarchy of expertise, in which economists who run randomized trials are taken more seriously than people who've worked in these areas for decades. So you might be a school administrator, and you've worked in a variety of schools over a period of 3 decades. But an economist who runs a randomized trial from their office in Pretoria, using people spread out across the country, will be the one who informs the president's policy that he announces in his State of the Nation address, even though they've maybe only been working in this area for a couple of years. And their knowledge of the education system may be highly questionable. Finally, the point that I was referring to earlier, in these countries. In other words, that I say we because we're here in South Africa, that we can't develop the way other countries did. We need randomized trials, we need foreign researchers coming in and running experiments on local poor populations in order to figure out what works. Now that might be right, but I've never seen any coherent argument to support that claim. Okay? So this is just a range of some of the issues that have been raised. Now, in my own work, I actually tried to cut through this clutter of legitimate objections to one problem with the randomist approach. So not just the use of randomized trials, but the actual approach of these advocates of randomized trials in economics for policy, okay, a methodological issue. And this is my most recent attempt to, I guess, explain it to a general audience. So you don't actually need to understand, I'll say a little bit about these equations. They're very simple equations. I'll say a little bit about them, but you don't actually need to really understand what's in the equations, and I'll show you why. It's a game of spot the difference, okay? So on the left-hand side, you've got the assumption, the econometric assumption, that's needed to identify causal relationships without experimental data, okay? So that's the one on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you've got the assumption that you need to extrapolate experimental results to populations, okay, outside the experiment, right? So the one is to identify relationships without experimental data. The other one is to extrapolate experimental results to generalize them to other populations. In particular, we can measure variables, that's actually the x's. We can measure variables that represent the characteristics of people in a given, let's say in a given population, in a given data set. And provided we can measure those characteristics, we can control for any differences between the people who benefit from a policy and those who don't. Okay? Now, if that's the case, then econometrically, you don't need an experiment to identify a causal relationship, right? So that's what that equation is saying. Now, the randomist doesn't say, well, that's not plausible. There's lots of reasons why people who benefit from a policy may be different to people who don't, okay? And I certainly accept that in some instances. So that's fine. That's the justification if you believe in quantitative methods for randomized trials. But what do they say about the other assumption? They say that other assumption is not a problem. Okay? So basically, yeah, generally speaking, we can generalize results from experimental populations to the ones we're interested in. Oh, and if we can't, then we'll just use our qualitative expertise to assess whether this assumption is likely to hold or not. So in this case, we're talking about instead of within a experimental result that you're interested in. Okay? So let me give an example, which is the basis for my PhD work. There's been a lot of work by economists on class size. Does student class size affect test scores? If you have 20 students in a grade 10 class, does that mean that they get higher test scores than if you have 40 students in their class, right? So I mentioned a quasi-experiment earlier that dealt with that, but there have also been randomized experiments, both in developed countries and in developing countries. Now in that situation, what you need is, so let's say you do, and this has been done, let's say you do an experiment in Western Kenya. You manipulate class sizes experimentally so that there are 25 students per class in one set of schools and 40 students per class in another set of schools. And you find that when it's 25 students per class, actually the scores are not very different, right? So then the argument the economists make is, you know what, class size doesn't really matter. And by the way, that means the education resources don't matter either. Because if you wanted to reduce class size from 40 per class to 25 per class, you'd need a lot more teachers, right, to start off with. Now, what's the problem there? Well, it's very interesting. If you back up, why does class size matter in the first place? It doesn't make sense to think of class size as a causal variable on its own, I would suggest. And as I say, my PhD was on this, so most educationalists don't think so either. Why does class size matter? Well, because it mediates what happens in the class. Right? So if you have a great teacher, it could make a very big difference if you have 50 students in a class versus 20. Because once you maybe get past 50 or 45, you just can't do good classroom management anymore. And furthermore, you're having to divide your time across almost double the number of students. If you have a teacher that's completely incompetent, right, in fact, they don't even understand the material they're teaching, then it may well not make a difference whether you have 25 students in a class or 50, because either way, the students are not learning anything. Right? So yes, their behavior might be different and so forth, but the result is very different. Okay? So if we accept that, well, if you do a randomized trial in, say, 100 schools in Western Kenya, how do you extrapolate that result to a different population if you don't have measures of teacher quality? And my thumbs-up guess is that about 90 to 95% of randomized trials in education on class size don't have information on teacher quality. So basically, if you take this problem seriously, you can take those papers and you can bin them for policy purposes, right? If you want to extrapolate them to any other populations. So the problem here is really, you can call it a logical tension, you can call it a methodological inconsistency, or you can call it a hypocrisy. Okay? Because the formal structure of the assumption required for external, these are referred to as the external validity problem, taking results to other populations, and the internal validity problem, estimating and identifying causal relationships, is that the randomistas insist on the invalidity of the one assumption to justify the use of randomized trials, but they want to paper over the failure to meet the other assumption in order to use those randomized for policy. Okay? But this is, for me, this is the methodological flaw at the heart of the claims that the randomistas are making. Notice that this isn't a problem with just doing randomized trials for intellectual reasons. Okay? The problem is in advocating randomized trials to inform policy. Okay? And that ultimately is, as you saw, what the Nobel was awarded for. Okay, partly in the interest of time, let me turn to the South African education case. Okay, so I've got some extracts here from, so there's what I feel is a rather unfortunate article in the Sunday Times recently, that's top left. The impact of Nobel laureates' work is felt by South Africa's youth and kids in our classrooms. Method tests what actually works in the field. Then at the top right and bottom left, you've got papers, one in the Journal of Human Resources and the other in the South African Journal of Education, which are papers based on randomized trials that were conducted in the South African education system. And at the bottom right, you've got a tweet from probably the leading and most influential researcher in the Department of Basic Education, who's also affiliated to Stellenbosch, basically celebrating the fact that the president announced a policy earlier this year based on a series of, a piece of research that they'd done based on a series of randomized trials. Okay? So just in case you had any doubts, this is just to illustrate the influence of this particular approach on South African basic education policy. And there are many, many more examples that I could provide. Okay, so let me just turn as an illustration to one example of a really flawed experiment. So this was presented at the Economic Society of South Africa conference in 2013. I discussed my concerns with the author at the time. So the study was geography and life sciences, right? So basically, it was literally, they just posted these study guides to the school. To my knowledge, there weren't even people there to receive them, to instruct people how to use them. They basically just dumped them at the schools, right? And then afterwards, because they're Department of Basic Education officials, they could look at the student outcomes, the test scores, right? And the kind of punchline claim from this paper, the title of which is there, and the authors as well, is that the intervention was amongst the most cost-effective of educational interventions internationally that have been tested using randomized experiments. Okay? So that's a very strong claim. Now, the finding was that basically for accounting and economics, there was no statistically significant result. Okay? But for geography and life sciences, it increased student performance by about 2 percentage points, okay, in their test scores. And from that, they make this claim, okay, based on the cost of the study guides and the change in student scores. All right? So the problems I raised with one of the authors at the time, which still stand, the first is that this is what's called in economics specification searching, or at least that's my view. So you allocate these study guides for 4 different subjects. You don't really have a theory about why they would work for one subject or another subject. Then you run your statistical tests. You find that, okay, for 2 it's not significant, for 2 it's significant, so we're just going to say it works. Well, I mean, if you want to cover your bases, you could run it for 8 subjects, and the more subjects you run it for statistically, the more likely you are to find a result. Okay, that's what's called specification searching in economics. Another problem is that there's no basis for external validity. So how do you extrapolate this from 79 schools in Mpumalanga to any other schools in any other provinces, right? What's your basis for doing that? You don't know why it worked. As I said, the schools could have sold these study guides, bought biscuits, that increased student motivation. I could come up with a story as to why it increased student motivation in geography and life sciences and not accounting and economics. In which case, we'd be better off just giving students biscuits, right? Rather than study guides. And as I say, so that's linked to the issue that there's no credible explanation for variation across subjects. Okay? Now, it is somewhat reassuring. I acknowledge this paper hasn't been published, but it is nevertheless illustrative of the kinds of experiments that have been done. And those experiments have become more sophisticated, partly in response to criticism, but in the absence of any acknowledgement of past failures or past criticisms, which is a point I'm going to get to now. Okay. So on the one hand, we've got the scientism that's kind of swept into South African economics. And by the way, I should say, I can't speak in a definitive way about what happens in other academic disciplines in South Africa. But in economics, we have this disconcerting trend where usually we're about 10 to 20 years behind the curve. Okay, so the thing is, the wave of randomized trials in international economics and in the US started in about the early 1990s. There's a famous paper by Josh Angrist on the US draft Vietnam lottery, for example. So that started in the US in the early 1990s. And in South Africa, the wave kind of started to hit really when the Jamal Abdul Latif Poverty Action Lab was established at the University of Cape Town in 2010. Very unfortunate for me because I just started doing my PhD at the time criticizing randomized trials, and J-PAL dropped its Africa headquarters right next to where I was working. So we've had that sort of delayed sweep in of scientism into South African economics, and in particular to the economics of education. But that's combined with some important local factors, okay? And one of those is that, and so I would say that even though J-PAL is based at UCT, I would say that actually the most influential research center thus far has been RECEP. Okay, so RECEP is based at Stellenbosch. I think it's got more economists of education than any other institute in South Africa. But more importantly, it has very close ties to the Department of Basic Education. So some of its academics are actually based in the department, some have been sent through there. There's a sort of symbiosis these days between the Department of Basic Education and RECEP at Stellenbosch. And that's concerning because it also amounts to something a bit like an intellectual monopoly. And as economists should know, monopolies are inefficient and usually harmful. And it is one of the consequences space. So you might get one research center that's very active, and as a result, it just dominates a particular policy issue. So RECEP has taken very education resources in South Africa are adequate because they're high by international standards. So the argument basically went something like this. Do I put it here? Yes. So it originates in a 2008 paper by Sefas van der Berg, the director of RECEP, in the Journal of African Economies, in which he argued that because South Africa spent a relatively high proportion of its GDP on basic education, that must mean that resources for education in South Africa were adequate, relatively speaking, and therefore the problems in the education system must lie elsewhere. That was the logic of the argument. It wasn't fleshed out in a great level of detail, and that argument has become entrenched in policy circles. It became entrenched in teaching in economics as well. So that's why when I came to do this Oxfam report 12, I was expecting to find exactly the same thing, right? Because that's what I'd been taught. But it's not the case. Okay? And I showed that in that 2012 report and a 2013 presentation, which I did at that Economic Society of South Africa conference, and where Professor van den Berg was present and didn't raise any concerns. So the first thing is that actually South African allocation to basic education is not high by international standards when you use the appropriate metrics. And the appropriate metrics take into account per student allocations. Now, even if you're not familiar with these kinds of calculations, you might know that in South Africa, we have a bit of a population bulge when it comes to the proportion of youth in the overall population. Okay? So I've got some sort of complicated econometric decompositions and so forth. But the basic idea is that the measure that had been used to come to this conclusion didn't take into account population. Okay? It didn't take into account per student allocations. And once you do that, South Africa will move from something like a ranking of maybe anywhere between sort of 30 and 40 internationally down to 80 or 90. Okay? So all of a sudden, it's at best average, but it's probably below average. Okay? So that logic is out of the water. But then when you look at other indicators such as class size, you see that the Department of Basic Education's fairly modest targets for class size are also being consistently exceeded. Right? And the first and primary conclusion that you can probably draw from that is that there aren't enough teachers. And if there aren't enough teachers, there aren't enough resources. RECEP has squirmed in various ways to try and avoid that conclusion. So in some of their reports, for example, they argue that it's about scheduling. If only schools were more efficient scheduling classes, then we wouldn't have these problems with class size. But there's no evidence to that effect. So I think a reason, because if you really think that there's enough teachers in the system, well, you can probably get rid of 10%. And it's not going to do any harm. But if you recognize the fact that actually the system is under-resourced, all of a sudden you realize, well, this is not somewhere where we should be cutting government funding. Okay, so let me I've tried to kind of provide a visual illustration of what I think the problem is here. So, boy, it's a bit complicated, but it's a real simplification of what I think the education system actually looks like. Okay, so the stuff in green is what I think RCEP and organizations like it, and economists running randomized trials in the realm of economics in South Africa, that's what they're looking at. Okay? So they look at things like resistance to accountability mechanisms by teachers. They look at growing union power and negative effects of that. They look at the caliber of staff. So any of you who've read about this in South African newspapers, you'll have seen these studies. Teachers teaching at a particular level can't even pass the exams that their students are expected to pass. Obviously, that's dire. Right? And it's very hard to argue with those findings because they've been reproduced across a number of different surveys and so forth. So yes, our teachers are not as good as they should be. So what's the approach to that? Well, for example, if you were to take a paper that was published based on India, where they gave students cameras to take pictures of their teachers to make sure the teachers were present. Right? So the arguments there's a deficit argument on the side of the teacher. The teacher's lazy, they're not coming to school, or alternatively the teachers are incompetent, so we need to train them more. Right? There's these deficit notions. That's if you just focus on the simplistic notion. Right? So you're looking at the teachers are not good enough, that has a negative effect on student learning and performance. Right? Okay, but now what about the alternative hypothesis, which is the one that I have? That the education system is systematically under-resourced and understaffed. What does the system look like then? Okay, well, start out here. Inadequate per capita student funding. What does that mean? Well, first of all, you have large class sizes. Okay? That leads to a very negative working environment, which leads to attrition of teachers. Teachers leave. That has a negative effect on the caliber of staff, right? So the best people, everything else equal, the best people are the ones who can leave. Okay? So you have under-resourcing leading to large class sizes, bad professional environment, low quality teachers. Okay? There's also low educator motivation and effort. So yes, if you go and do a survey, you'll find that there's a lot of teachers who are bunking classes at particular times in the day. But do you know what their working environment is like? And do you know the extent to which the working environment is affected by inadequate per student funding? Now, so to emphasize, so this is just one example. You can read through other aspects of the system. But if, for example, you come in as a randomista, maybe you're going to focus on this, okay? Low educator motivation and effort. So what are you going to do? You're going to run a randomized trial where you give students cameras to try and make these teachers attend more. Okay? But that's not going to resolve the negative professional environment that's led to their low attendance anyway, which could also be due to stress, emotional breakdowns, health problems, all these kinds of things. Getting students to monitor their teachers or introducing biometric monitoring systems is not going to affect these fundamental structural factors. Okay? So what we have is a combination of a problematic methodology, which focuses us on these very narrow questions, combined with a misdiagnosis of one of the key factors in the South African education system. And that's a deeply harmful combination. And what we've seen is that the people who've been pushing this line are also very stubborn in pushing it. So RCEP was contracted to produce this report for the presidency, right? So the highest policy level in South Africa. What are the constraints to progress in education? And they called it identifying binding constraints in education. So the notion of a binding constraint is also a very economistic use of language. But if you read through that report, nowhere does it say that resources are a binding constraint. Despite the fact, as I've said, the previous reason for assuming that is incorrect. But there was no effort to really assess whether resources were an issue. And if they are an issue, which is in my view, but it can at least be a subject of debate, if they are an issue, then that will undermine any interventions that try to take place without accounting for that constraint. Okay? So ultimately, having tried to engage, and I think I mentioned this in the next slide, having tried to engage with these practitioners, I ultimately resorted to a public challenge in a national newspaper, in Business Day. Because there was an article written by one RCEP researcher which attacked the National Treasury for underfunding basic education. And I agreed with the article, but the problem I had with it was that the National Treasury felt justified in underfunding basic education because of the advice it was getting from economists of education at Stellenbosch, right? So it was deeply hypocritical to be writing an article attacking the National Treasury for doing what it was told to do. And so the challenge I put to Professor van den Berg, there was an exchange which happened, was he said in a letter that RCEP has consistently shown that a general increase in fiscal resources is unlikely to improve the quality of education significantly. Okay, so that was his claim in the preceding letter, and I quoted it there directly. So what I said in my challenge was, provide one paper that substantiates this claim, and I will write a public refutation of that paper, and I will invite you to debate that. and they've never replied. Now, I didn't do this for showmanship. As I said, I had tried to engage with them in previous years. But ultimately, you get to a point where there's a research group that has essentially captured influence of a particular very critical policy area, and you simply can't get through to policymakers because they believe they're being informed by scientists. So ultimately, you resort to this kind of public challenge, which should be very easy to meet. After all, it is one of the fundamental premises of their research program. So it shouldn't be hard to provide a paper that substantiates that claim. But to my knowledge, no such paper exists, and certainly none has ever been provided to me. Okay, so I want to, I'll try and wrap up in the next 5 to 10. I want to kind of make a related aside to that, because this is kind of a dynamic that's been very difficult for me in my work and also communicating with, I guess, a broader audience. And I can't find more polite words for it other than intellectual disingenuousness and what I call shape-shifting. Okay? So one reason I mention this is because I often get a response, including to public challenges like that, to say, why are you being so aggressive with these challenges? Why don't you engage with the protagonists in a nicer way? Well, the answer is, I did try to do that. Okay? So, just a listing of some of them. I had in-person discussions with Stellenbosch or Department of Basic Education randomistas in 2012, at the Economic Society of South Africa conference in 2013, 2017, and with their international counterparts at the World Bank and the Campbell Colloquium, which is a more interdisciplinary initiative, in 2014. And I did challenge Rachel Glenister, who's now the chief economist for DFID in the UK, and apparently is also the partner of Michael Kramer, who's one of the Nobel awardees, but I didn't know that, but she's a very influential economist in her own right, when she came to Cape Town in 2015. In one of these sessions where typically what happens is that the high-profile American economists will fly in, and they'll basically tell the local researchers what the current cutting edge and counter-arguments are, and then they'll leave. And that just gets uncritically replicated in the local domain, obviously with a little bit of a local flavor. So, you know, and just to go back to that earlier example, so here's this paper published in 2017. One of the authors is one of these individuals I engaged with in 2013. There's a discussion of external validity in that paper. It gives no acknowledgement to those prior discussions and doesn't cite any of the related work. Okay? So the problem is that there's a systematic effort to avoid these criticisms, and I think the reason is simply because they can't actually be answered. Okay? And that's gonna take us to the issue of the missionary approach, but it means that there's a certain kind of shape-shifting. So that example I gave earlier of that randomized trial with study guides, that was the first crude instantiation of this particular approach. It's subsequently become more sophisticated, and you'll find in some of the papers they now talk about external validity and extrapolation, even though they can't address the problem, but there's a lot more gesturing at it, right? But no acknowledgement that anything that was done in the past was wrong, or that any of the policies based on those past experiments and results were wrong, okay? So there's no acknowledgement that there was ever a past failure, but there's a more sophisticated rhetoric, okay, which comes with time. Okay, so sort of coming towards a conclusion, let me just say, so I use this missionary analogy, and I do think it's very powerful. I think Bardan is really onto something very important here. But I don't want to get into, as I say, to the details of the individuals who've been most influential in these areas internationally and locally. I do want to acknowledge that, of course, South Africa, countries like South Africa have a complex relationship with missionaries. Okay? So many of our schools had missionary origins, and we know that some of the most important early leaders of, for example, the ANC, the African National Congress, went to missionary schools. South Africans will be aware that one of the real failures of the arguments in favor of colonialism and missionaries is the absence of a counterfactual. The assumption is, for example, if missionaries hadn't come in and given missionary education to black South Africans, they would never have acquired the knowledge that they did. But why would we believe that? Because there's all kinds of ways societies exchange culture and knowledge that are important in this particular case. So first of all, there seems to be a presumption. It's not just the randomistas, but it seems to reach its peak with the randomistas. There's a presumption that one has a calling to help the black and brown huddled masses of the world. That your calling is to alleviate world poverty, and world poverty, as we know, largely affects black and brown people. Okay, so I don't think that's something that we should leave unquestioned. Because there are lots of people who don't see it as their calling to resolve such issues. A second one, which I kind of came to realize quite late, is sort of the notion that adults are sinners, but children are innocent. You know, and if one reads into the history, one sees very nasty versions of that. For example, with the sort of extermination of Aboriginal populations in Australia, where adults were exterminated, but children were taken from their families and raised by white families. Okay? Now, in this particular case, it's not quite as dramatic, but if you read some of this literature, it's sort of teachers are lazy, politicians are suspect, school administrators are suspect, principals are not leading as they should, but the children, we want to help the children. Okay? So this is particularly marked in the education context. And of course, it was very much the narrative around missionaries back in the 19th and 20th century. Another one is this very definitive view that these practitioners' methodological stance is the correct stance. Okay? Much as a missionary might view that their particular word, their particular gospel is the one that is legitimate, and very hostile to criticism, which in the case of religion is understandable, because religion is not intended generally to be based on sort of robust intellectual engagement. It's based on faith. But in the case of academic arguments, there should be much more engagement, sincere engagement with criticism, and I would suggest that we haven't seen a lot of that. Another is that the approach emphasizes the need, and if you read the documents of organizations like JPAL, 3IE, DIME at the World Bank, a lot of the emphasis is on we need to persuade policymakers, we need to persuade civil servants that our approach is the right one to take. It's not a matter of engaging with them and letting them decide whether they think this is the right approach. We need to persuade. So the rhetoric is around persuasion, policy influence, and so forth. And linked to that is this hierarchical and asymmetric set of relationships in which locals are at best imitative, right? So you have locals who are essentially trying to do what the randomistas are doing internationally. So that's kind of the best case scenario because at least they have some kind of agency, but it's still imitative and uncritical. But at worst, locals are really only acceptable as unthinking functionaries. So for data collection. And in many of those instances, if you look at these kinds of relationships, it's not really clear how they're different from when colonial explorers came in and they had native assistants to show them the lie of the land and identify particular species and so forth, and basically collect data. Okay? And it's not just a problem that applies to the randomistas, but I do think it's most acute in that particular case. So to conclude, what is the harm? Okay? What is the harm that is happening here? So I'd suggest it's twofold. So first of all, this approach takes epistemic authority. Okay? So it devalues the knowledge of those who might, for example, have non-quantitative knowledge of the education system, and it gives it to economists seemingly with savior or missionary orientations engaged in this kind of imitative scientism, which anyway isn't justified by their own methodological arguments, which is the point I made earlier about the assumptions that are accepted for experiments, but rejected or not held to be important when it comes to extrapolation. And linked to this, by the way, is if you read some of the narrative when the randomistas are criticized for their approach, they'll say, oh no, but we learned so much in the field when we were observing how these experiments were implemented. And that's how we know that, in fact, we know how it worked or we know how it'll extrapolate to another population. Okay, well, then why can't we just talk to anthropologists? Because after all, they're the ones who've been trained to actually understand things through qualitative engagement. Why do you have to run a randomized trial first to be deemed credible, and only then shall we listen to your qualitative and anecdotal accounts? And I've been to seminars by randomistas where when challenged on something, they will say, well, this one time we were driving down the road to Busia, and we saw this thing happen, and we stopped and we spoke, and thereby we came to understand this particular dynamic. I don't have a problem with that per se, but of course it's in sharp contrast to the overall methodological approach. So that's the one hand. That's the one side. It's this epistemic harm. And on the other hand is that our policies and actions are oriented towards interventions that are suited to experimental and quasi-experimental assessment, while the substantive problems, as I was showing in that simplification of the education system, are deeper and at the system level. So that leads to misdiagnosis, but it also leads to a misdirection of effort and analysis. So what's the conclusion? Well, what I think is actually happening is that our education policy in South Africa is being stunted by this dynamic. I don't think we're going anywhere. And I think what it's doing is it's preventing us from engaging with these systemic issues. And the consequence could be that, in fact, the South African education system, counterfactually, is harmed for generations to come. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean. exaggeration. I will, however, go out and live and speculate that you won't win the Nobel Prize soon, because we can't get away from the political economy of economics, which I happen to believe explains the explosion in experimental economics has been post-2008, post-financial crisis, and it's particularly significant in the field of development economics. You know, and I think your missionary analogy, obviously, I'm very comfortable with that, having written a book that likens economics to a religion. I think it is this sort of fertile territory, this sort of uncharted territory we don't yet know. It's still the dark continent, or the dark continents, as it were. And this is where we can really understand humans in the existing state. My hypothesis is that economic theory, because before 2008, as you were saying in your remarks that economists say, well, if there's no experimental evidence, we don't even consider it scientific. But of course, prior to the financial crisis, there was a fetishization of pure theory, and most of the Nobel Prizes were going to people who were doing completely theoretical work, modeled on theoretical physics, and I think particularly Smith with developments in quantum mechanics. And then there was this tremendous criticism, it was provoked by none other than the famous and the infamous Queen's question, at the opening of a building at the London School of Economics, where she figured, I'm in a room full of economists. My financial advisors have just told me that I've lost a third of my estate in the last couple of months. And she said, why didn't you see it coming? And of course, none of them had an answer. And this became a sort of an illustration of what was wrong with economics, is they were so enamored with the theory, they weren't looking at what was happening on the ground. So experimental economics became what, to use an American sports analogy, became the Hail Mary pass. It was the last desperate play before in the dying seconds of the game to try and rescue the field. And it became a way that all sorts of economists who weren't paying much attention to it, I think, were now saying, but look at all this wonderful work. You get a lot of talk in economics about the data revolution, though there's a tremendous amount of data work being done. Right. Although, like you, I would question the actual value, and if in fact they're reinventing the wheel, doing data work that other people have been doing for a long time and frankly doing better. Is that really what is driving, in your opinion? Would you agree, or is there something else? Or am I simply wrong to characterize it as being the growth industry in the last decade, sometimes disingenuously being embraced by people who previously sneered at it, because it is a way to sort of defend the relevance of discipline that is coming with tremendous criticism for being detached from reality?
Right. I think that's a great question. So what I would say is that that's not the narrative. It's certainly not the narrative in microeconomics, applied microeconomics. The narrative is that causal identification was sort of more appreciated as a problem from the 1990s. Various economists showed how experimental work could be used to address that, and randomized trials and the randomists are a sort of a natural emergence of that, with a particular application to world poverty, which of course is a nice line because it, as you say, it bridges this gap between the claims that economists are sort of in ivory towers and irrelevant, with very real world problems. But I think you're probably right that I suspect there is an element to which it has to do with the political economy of the discipline after the global financial crisis. The only thing there, though, is that, of course, the financial crisis, those kinds of questions, the Queen's question is about macroeconomics. And macroeconomics is a very different beast, contradiction in their approach, because it's kind of a form of data mining. But in microeconometrics, for many decades, data mining was seen as a dirty word. So now we're doing data mining with randomized trials, and it's acceptable. Yes, there's some nuanced differences, but there's a tension there. In macroeconometrics, however, because of the nature of the data, you've never really had the luxury to claim causal identification, even though some sort of creative efforts have been made. And so, in fact, the use of machine learning there is more consistent, because there isn't a claim that you're actually identifying causal relationships. We're basically just trying to use sophisticated artificial learning to predict what's going to happen next, even though we don't understand what the foundations of those predictions are. But the other thing, I mean, the issue of theory is, so you're leading me into terrain which in some ways I was trying to avoid, because, so I submitted, to give you a sense, I submitted the first chapter of my PhD to a top economics journal, and after an 18-month process, it was finally rejected. And the most positive review I got, which recommended rejection, said, I feel sorry for this author because the approach he's taken is going to piss off both groups of people, because neither is satisfied with the way their area is being treated. And the other side with the structural econometricians. Because there are lots of problems with structural econometrics. And this is where, and I didn't really touch on this because it's a bit in the history, but one of the reasons also why randomized trials took off in a micro is because a lot of people were skeptical about the assumptions you have because of dissatisfaction with theoretical work, with these abstract models that often couldn't be convincingly defended. And there's an entire separate literature, which is still very active, I follow it quite closely, amongst philosophers and methodologists, about are the fictional models that economists use, are they actually useful? And how can we possibly construct arguments as to why they are? But the fact that that's still very much an area of debate and research indicates just how much dissatisfaction and lack of credibility, hence also the credibility revolution, how much credibility theoretical models were believed to have.
Yeah. But we may still be living in the shadow of Milton Friedman's famous, or infamous positive economics, where he said we don't have to know what is causing something, provided we can identify a relationship, we know it works, which is very much the method. Anyhow. Thank you so much. Let me throw the floor open. So starting here and then here, and then we have a few. And then okay, go ahead. Do you want to open the question?
Hi, yeah, evening. Thank you so much for that talk. It was really fascinating. I think one of the really interesting questions on this. So I think it's really interesting that you make the point that South Africa's basic education system is unfunded and under-resourced. I wonder though, so I come from an organization called the Center for Development and Enterprise, and we're very interested in system reform, system improvements, shall we say, of basic education outcomes. And I'm by no means an econometrician, which is why I'm here, to find out more from you. So, but some of the research that we've sort of done seems to indicate that South Africa, or a lot of, maybe the use of the word expert will be contested here, but a lot of the experts that we've sort of looked at seem to suggest that South Africa has a very cost-ineffective basic education system. So, for example, I think it's Uganda who spends a 30th of the, and this is in US dollar PPP terms, a 30th of the amount that South Africa spends on children, students, learners. And yet we get similar results in the SACMEC, the sort of regional international tests. And I think it's Lon Pritchard who sort of, they have a 6.5-year improvement over South Africa in terms of the efficiency of the system. So I think I just want to hear from you what you think, regardless of whether the system is unfunded or under-resourced and so on. Why do you think, or what kind of research have you done, or what have you found as to indicating why South Africa's basic education system is so cost ineffective? And if we don't have answers to that, what can we do to figure out what's the cause of that?
Why don't we do a question at a time?
Yeah,
sorry,
please.
yeah, that's a lot. Sorry.
Yeah, so I am familiar with pretty much all of these debates, whether it's Pritchett or Hanishek, or in this case you're probably drawing on Spall in South Africa, so I'm aware of those, that work for CDE. So I think CDE is a victim of this narrative around resourcing, as the Department of Basic Education is, as the presidency has been. I think these efficiency analyses are, they're the kinds of things that economists like to do, but when you actually drill down into the methodology, they're not very credible. So for example, let's say you say Uganda, right? So they spend 1/30. Well, we know that the vast majority of spending on basic education is on teacher salaries. So what that means is teachers are paid a lot less. Okay, what do we think would happen in South Africa if we slash, let's just say exogenously, forget about the unions, we slash teacher salaries by, we made them 1/10 of what they are. What do we think would happen? Right? I don't think you need to be an economist or an expert to figure out what the answer to that question is, right? Because right now, we're not attracting suitably qualified teachers into the profession. We're not managing to retain them, and we're not giving them a work environment in which they can actually achieve outcomes. So I just use that as an illustration, right? But yeah, this notion of sort of cost effectiveness. So this is something that I'll elaborate on in the full paper, but here's another way of thinking about it, right? So if you have a system that is inadequately funded, right, that in itself is going to create inefficiencies. Okay? Let's take a different example, healthcare. Okay? So there's some contestation about this, but there's been a dramatic increase in medico-legal liabilities in the South African healthcare system. At the same time as there have been real cuts in per-patient allocations. Why might that be? Well, maybe because when nurses and doctors are working in deeply under-resourced environments, they don't have enough sleep, they don't have enough support, they don't have the medical equipment they need, they don't have proper sanitation and hygiene, they make more errors. Right? So now that's an inefficiency. If you look at our I'm sure if you look at our medico-legal liabilities compared to other countries, you're going to find they're quite a lot higher. But one can make an argument that those themselves arise from under-resourcing. So, it's a complex question, the issue of like what is an adequate level of resourcing. What I would say is, look at the class sizes, look at the people who are coming into and out of the system. Go into some of these schools. And that's why I say, so I'm trained as an economist, but I'm very sympathetic to qualitative evidence. We have, for example, recently we've had the spurt of reporting on violence at schools, children getting shot and stabbed. If you're talking to educationists, all of those things were happening already. I myself have spoken to educationists who were teaching at a Quintile 1 school when gangsters jumped over the fence with machetes, right? So, again, we're going to say, the system isn't efficient enough. What does that mean? What is the counterfactual? What would a more efficient system look like? So first of all, so let me just say two things. The first one is that, and what your question draws attention to as a logical matter, is that in my work, I would say I refuted the premise for the RECEP argument that the South African education system was under-resourced. That in itself doesn't prove the system is under-resourced. Okay? So I just refuted the premise of their argument. Then there's a second burden on me or other people to say, is the system resourced or not? And looking at some indicators, I'm saying, no, I think it's under-resourced. For example, if you look at class size. Okay? That takes into account, that assumes that factors like teacher salaries and so forth are fixed. But what I would say is that I think a lot of those indicators do show that. I've also looked at teacher workloads. So class sizes, teacher workloads, other people have looked at actually just basic educational resources. There's schools that don't have electricity, infrastructure issues and sanitation issues. So all of those indicators are there. So I would say the burden of proof is on where the teachers are going to come from who will accept those salaries. And right now, we don't have enough teachers who will accept the current salaries, right? So it's an important issue, but that's my preliminary response.
Firstly, thanks for the presentation.
Thanks.
Allow me to possibly calm down the conversation. I've been trying to reconcile this, in my head for a while. With all points being considered, lack of resources and all the points that you're pointing out, how much of this is actually the contents that the kids are given in the class? And how much of it is actually the language of instruction that the children are being taught? Because if you look at all the things, if you have a night here, the teacher is well paid, the teacher is possibly greater on the do. If you're not teaching me the language of instruction that I understand or would like to understand, and if the content actually is cutting edge and is at a level where it can be competitive in the economic sector or across other countries, how much of it has there been any focus in all of the studies in the actual contents that has been taught?
Right. So, it's very important to say I'm not an educationist. I'm an economist, and essentially I'm an economist arguing against the undue influence of economists. So it'd be very wrong for me to then stand up here and say definitive things about the education system outside of financing and economics. What I would say is that, nevertheless, I'm aware of the literatures, okay? So, yes, a number of educationists have looked at questions about language of instruction, not just in South Africa, but other countries, also issues around content. And there are differing views. For example, some people take the view that it's important to keep mother tongue instruction for the early years of schooling to develop a certain kind of foundation and then do a managed transition. There are probably other people here who can talk more to that. But what I would say is that educationists have done work on this, and strategies have been implemented in other countries without randomized trials. Some of these issues are now being taken up by policymakers because economists are doing randomized trials on them. And I think that's misplaced.
Thanks. I completely agree with your approach, and it's a fantastically refreshing paper. Thank you very much. My question is really about what comes first? Is it the politics and the policy or the research? The way I read this and much policy research is that it's actually legitimatory. So the study guides, you know, it's an intervention, it's a policy initiative, it's taken on much as workbooks were or anything else, and then there needs to be some kind of legitimation for it retrospectively.
Right.
So can you just reflect on that in the South African context? What comes first?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I have worked in the public sector, and I have a reasonably good idea of how these dynamics work. What I'll say is there's an international literature. So the narrative is evidence-based policy. A number of critics have noted that one often gets policy-based evidence. Okay, so in other words, policymakers in various kinds of foundations, I was talking to John about this, will commission work in order to validate the approaches that they're already taking. Okay, and you know, if you've done this kind of work, you also know, and if you've read other people's work, you know that there are ways in which certain forms of analysis can be rigged. One way is choosing what you analyze. I was being a bit generous to National Treasury earlier when I was talking about that particular exchange in Business Day, because National Treasury have also been happy to have an excuse not to give more money to basic education. In recent times, that's because they really are strained for finances. In previous years, I think it was partly ideological, that people in the Treasury also believed that the teachers were lazy and the system had adequate resourcing because they'd read that paper in 2008 or in earlier versions, and they didn't really want to give more money to basic education. And what's interesting also is the Department of Basic Education. I mean, in some sense, they're the real villains at the center of this, because the Department of Basic Education, to my knowledge, has never materially lobbied National Treasury for more funds. So they're quite happy to have people who are producing this research that's premised on there being adequate resources and these kinds of sort of marginal interventions. But I think sort of maybe at the core of your point is the fact that there are certain kinds of interventions that will never be tested because people are not interested in considering whether they might work or not. So, and this is something I kind of address in some other work, but essentially the set of interventions that you might consider is already predetermined by whatever your views might be about how the system works, about how you think it should work, about the kinds of things government could do. So I think that's definitely part of the dynamic, and it also raises concerns around sort of ideological orientation and positionality and that sort of thing. If economists in particular favor certain kinds of interventions around efficiency or around incentives, but not other kinds of things like creating a pleasant work environment, for example. So there are definitely biases in the actual choice of evaluations that are implemented. Yeah.
Thanks, John. Cool, thanks. Also, thanks for the presentation. I'd like to know what you could say about the role that economists should take, and particularly what's available. What are the tools available in an economist's toolkit to actually assist in this policy making, right? Because the premise, if I say shame, what the randomistas are trying to get at is, maybe rigor. Let's contest the term. They're trying to get at having tight, very causally clear sort of explanations for this within their realm. Within their subject matter, and they're just getting it wrong in the case of RCTs. What would you say they should be doing using two criteria, i.e. to still maintain the rigor but still be in the realm of economics?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question because a good answer would be about book length, I think, and it's not quite yet the subject of my current book. I do have a number of views about that, but let me defer to somebody else who's written about this relatively recently, and who I think would be an unquestionably deserving recipient of the Nobel in the next 5 years, Charles Mansky. So Charles Mansky. So he's at Northwestern. He's a microeconometrician. And he wrote this book called Public Policy in an Uncertain World. And he refers to this problem of economists, and he particularly does target people like Chetty. Okay? There was an article in the New York Times at some point based on a paper co-authored by Chetty about class size and this dramatic claim about the influence of class size and its implications for policy. Mansky says, the problem is that economists are expressing incredible certitude, right? So the prescriptions and the claims they make based on their experimental analyses. And so what's the response to that? Well, the easy response to that is modesty. Be more modest, right? Of course, Mansky has his own views about how methodology should change, and I have my own views. But start off by being modest. Okay? So don't assume that you know more about the education system because you commissioned a randomized trial and you sat at your desk and you calculated some treatment effects, right? You don't. In fact, you probably know very little about the education system. So I think modesty is very important, and in the policy, and also understanding the distinction between intellectual analysis and policy analysis. So it's fine, leaving ethical concerns aside, right? There's nothing wrong with running randomized trials as a means of intellectual analysis, much like there's nothing wrong with constructing theoretical models. Where the problem comes in is when you claim policy significance for that. So another great economist on John's point about theory is Ariel Rubinstein. If you read Rubinstein, well-regarded microtheorist, he says, I'm just very glad that people pay me to do something that I enjoy doing, but I don't necessarily claim that these models I develop have any relevance to the real world. So at some point, one has to find some kind of bridge between what economists do. I do think economists can provide useful insights, but I think we have to be very careful in the claims we make. I think we need to be more pluralistic. I don't believe in this hierarchy of evidence at all. And I don't think we should be obsessed with particular methods.
Okay, please.
Maybe Tussicon and randomize it.
Thank you very much, Sean. It's been a lot from economics. I don't have anything robust to say except that I do ethics for the School of Economics. And the question is, what comes first, politics or policy? When I do an assessment of the ethical clearance application, there are some application, even if the risk is not high, I can tell because I know the communities that this is not going to work. Even the results that are going to come out from this study are just not going to solve anything because of the way the study will be conducted. I'm not against randomizing anything, but some of the issues we have in our schools, they need us as researchers to sort of live within those environments and know exactly what else could affect my results, because there are so many things. There's a school that got all the nice things, the projectors and all that, and the teachers were happy. And the following day, the school was vandalized, everything was taken. It had nothing to do with the teachers, it had nothing to do with the school, but it was an outside element, meaning that even the environments where the schools are do affect how the schools operate, the results and all. So my point is, the way we do things as, I don't think I'm an economist, but I'm in the School of Economics, the way we do things somehow has to change, but I'm not sure. I'm sure one by one we can try and do this. When you do research, be part of that community, know exactly what can affect you in your results, the way you're going to present your results. That is my understanding. I'm trying to follow that. I'm not sure if it's the right thing, but considering what Sean has said, it's very, very exciting to me, even at a spiritual level. I don't know how does Sean know these things, but he happens to know them because as I was talking, I'm reflecting at a spiritual level that this is what we should be saying as healers. This is what we are crying for, but we don't know how to articulate it. So, thank you.
Thanks. I mean, I would just add one thing there, just if you're interested on the ethical side, is that there have been some very interesting debates on social media since the award, and one of them has been around ethics. And I think there is a push for greater attention to the ethical approval that's given for these trials, and particularly in populations that could be deemed vulnerable. So I think it's going to be very interesting to watch how that debate goes.
But surely if I want promotion and I have to approve about 5 applications, I will approve them because I want to promote them.
No, you won't.
I'm done. I'm done.
I have 2 comments and 1 question. So I think I also need to explain a little bit. I'm completely not in economics, so I'm coming from education background and also a little bit into the philosophy of science. So when you talk about whole extrapolation and all that, that's kind of ringing the bell. And my first question is, first comment is actually on that. I think, although to some extent, talking about external validity and the causal relationship is kind of, there's a little link what you say that it's important to understand why it works or what works, so that's the link between the two. But on the other hand, I think it's also not directly meaningful to talk about extrapolation before you establish this thing is effective, because I mean, what do you want to extrapolate into? So I think it's important to focus on what, to understand actually what causes what works first before we talk about external validity. That's my first comment. The second part is really coming back to this causal relationship. I think it's important that you point out, and you talk about, you look at the data, it's not only to say that spend 5% or whatever percent on the GDP on education, it's enough, but you need to look at the population. I think that's important. But on the other hand, you establish to some extent that it's not enough funding, but still, how did you know that is the cause of poor performance? So my point is that, and it actually also linked to one of the things you said, that it's often important to ask the theory behind it, to ask your assumptions. Actually where you start to say this thing will cause that. And that actually, it has been a while, not too while, a book by Pearl on the Book of Why. So he's really trying to establish the ladder of causation, and that's kind of my comment and my the question is, and also when you criticize the recipe, the argument, that does not establish very well that it's coming from randomized control. So my question is actually on the RCT itself. So the question is, if we need to move my English is very if we want to move from correlation to causation, at least in Pearl's view, is that we have to do experiment. But then the question is, what kind of experiment? Again, I'm not totally convinced that RCT is the golden way, because lately, actually, I've been doing some meta-analysis of the RCT. Actually, I'm doing a synthesis of meta-analysis of RCTs. On bilingual education, and actually, they are still
Diamond standard.
But one of the things is RCT has a promise, or at least on paper or in theory, that it can ease out all the confounding factors. And that has one of the biggest issues in education, which is that it's so hard to tease out all the confounding because there are so many. And the interesting thing when I was looking at that in bilingual education is that even when you do RCT, you actually still cannot tease out those kind of things that actually make an impact. Very likely make an impact on the final result. So but my question coming back to that, if let's say RCT or experiment in general is not the best way, or one of the good ways, so how do we do experiment? I mean, the anthropology, whatever, they can see what's happening, but they cannot do counterfactual, they cannot do experiment. So how do we establish causal? If not through RCT or not through experiment?
Sean, I'm just going to exploit my privilege as a rider to that question, which is, do we actually need to conduct experiments?
Right, great, thank you. Right, so, okay, do we need to run experiments to establish causation? I don't think so, actually. I think there are ways of credibly establishing causation without experiments, and this is also one of the reasons why I'm being led into debates in philosophy of science, because that's ultimately where you end up. So I would probably agree with your instinct on that. But the second point is also that I'm skeptical of this obsession with causation. So you may not be an economist, but you're thinking about this like an economist, right? So you're thinking we need internal, and there's also a debate about internal validity versus external validity. Should we think of them as separate? Some philosophers say no, some say yes. I talk about them as separate just because it's useful to emphasize that fundamental inconsistency in what randomisters do, okay? But not necessarily because I believe it. But the question I'll put back to you is, and I'll get to the other parts of your comments and question as well, but other countries have succeeded in their education systems, and they didn't do so by running experiments to identify causal relationships between variables. So, one can go back through human history. How did we make progress in various areas without this particular very narrow notion of what constitutes effectiveness and causality? And I think in some senses, sort of academics, it's uncomfortable because it's not neatly defined. It's something that has a certain element of vagueness. It has a qualitative nature to it. But nevertheless, we've succeeded. Education systems have been built, highly successful education systems, without randomized trials. You don't seem to be convinced, but I mean, certainly particularly for my PhD, I actually had to read back into the history of the use of randomized trials in education. Sure, I mean, for my work, actually, I deliberately didn't use data from a developing country. I used it from the US. I've done that for all my dissertations. I like using American data. It kind of switches things around a bit. So there's this Project STAR experiment, which you're probably familiar with in Tennessee. Yeah, so some of these experiments were done, but by and large, the fundamental aspects, the pillars of these education systems and other social systems have been developed without that kind of sharp, notionally scientific clarity on what causal relationships are. So I think that approach itself needs to be substantiated. Why do we need to be concerned with identifying causal relationships in this way in order to act? So I'm not convinced of that argument. I should say, by the way, that Nancy Cartwright, the philosopher who's also worked with Angus Deaton, has written about what works and will it work for us. So her stuff is worth reading. On Pearl, I'm not sure Pearl, does he advocate experiments? So I haven't read the book of Why, but I read his highly technical book on causality beforehand, which many have referenced, but few have gone through the pain of reading. So he develops this do calculus, right? And so the premise of that is that there's a difference between causal relationships that exist somehow in the world and causal relationships that are brought into being by intervention. And there are also philosophers who've done, I think Woodward is the philosopher who's focused on a sort of notion of causality based on intervention. But I think that the whole causal graph analysis is partly premised on the view that actually we can identify causal relationships without necessarily experimenting. So in fact, if you read Heckman's work on Pearl, Heckman's saying, well, actually, and Heckman probably is a little ungenerous to Pearl, but he says, well, actually, if you go back to the early structural econometricians, they'd done a lot of this work already, because causal graphs impose a causal structure. They essentially assume they make certain assumptions about the causal structure, and then they estimate empirically these relationships. And that's very similar, actually, to what structural econometricians do. Okay? So, in fact, some people view the causal graphs approach as being a slight alternative to doing experiments, but you can combine them. And this is also one of the things that's starting to happen, partly because of mutual interest in microeconometrics, is that there's a coming together of the theoretical microeconometricians, the structural microeconometricians, and the randomistas, because in principle, you could use an experiment to identify the parameter of a structural model, right? So it doesn't have to be a fight, and there's strong incentives for it not to be a fight, right? So there's the coming together of these views. But I don't want to lose your rightly critical question about causality. About causality in my case, right? So that picture that I put up of the South African education system. So I did deliberately emphasize that this is my hypothesis, right? I think there's a lot of evidence to support that hypothesis, but it's not evidence of the randomized trial type, okay? So you can observe what's happened with class sizes, you can observe what's happened with teacher workloads, you can observe, I suggest that a bit more work needs to be done on that, but like an exodus of teachers, black teachers in particular in the 1990s, because they had more opportunities, right? So it's important to remember that under apartheid, teaching was one of the best jobs you could get as a black person because of the color bar and other limitations, right? When apartheid ended, there are many politicians, many successful business people and so forth, who were teachers, right? So there's all of this evidence, and in some sense, it's exactly the kind of illustration of a sort of counterweight to the randomized trial approach. We're trying to understand the system. We're not going to understand the system with experiments. And this is the other thing, because for any given issue, you could probably run 10 different types of experiments just on that issue. Now, if you're wanting to understand a whole system, there's thousands, maybe an infinite number of issues. So basically, you're never going to be able to run enough experiments to understand the system. And one of the points I also make in my prior work, and I'm doing some of my current work, is you've got the temporal problem. So people are still reanalyzing the STAR experiment. I mean, I reanalyze it in my work from the 1980s. It's now 2019. So whatever results I find, it's interesting methodologically, it's interesting for the discipline. But can I really say that those results apply 30 years later? Probably not. And I probably don't even understand why they don't apply. So I think we're facing, and this really comes back to the thing that's really the concern that's really driving this work and this presentation, which is that South Africa, we don't have a lot of time. We need fairly dramatic and structural institutional reform. And we don't have time to fiddle around doing randomized experiments which take 2 years to run, are based on methodologies that don't allow us to extrapolate, and don't really help us understand the system. We're just going to keep running in circles. And in 2 generations' time, we're going to look back and say, why didn't we do the same structural reforms that other people did in their countries? Obviously tailored to our local context. Why did we waste 10 or 20 years running randomized trials to identify causal effects that 10 years later were irrelevant anyway? So,
okay, Sean has been on his feet and on his toes for 90 minutes, so I'm just going to cut off. I'm going to take 2 more questions, this one here and then final one here. I'll ask you both to keep it brief if possible, so that you can allow me to get out of here reasonable time and the rest.
Hi, thank you.
hi, John.
The work's incredibly important for the reasons you gave. I just wanted to acknowledge that and continue. Very quickly, my schools in the Eastern Cape, etc., I can go on. Obviously, there is a resource shortage. So that's not a point to you, it's a point people don't want to accept in the country. And if you want to say yes, but only in those limited cases, I'll give another work with the system over many years. There's a position, the position in the structure of the department to support teachers who don't know the things they're supposed to be teaching is the role of a subject advisor, a subject specialist, a curriculum advisor that exists across the entire department. In most districts in the country, you have one person for a subject-grade combination in that area. You have one subject advisor for FET, meaning grade 10 to 12 maths, in the entire district of 400 or 500 schools. And that, I would say, is both evidence. Very few people know this because no one ever talks about it, but it's there in the data. It's not secret or hidden, right? So adding to your example, like class size, adding to others' activities. It's also an example, thank you again, of how, and the resourcing causes inefficiency, because the job description of this person says, you will go to schools and work one-on-one with teachers and coach them and mentor them and team teach and do these kinds of things. And when you're one, and there are 500 schools, each with so many teachers in your area, then you can't possibly do that. And when you try to do that, because that's what you were hired to do, you achieve nothing. You become demoralized. And the limited effort or resource we have from you is, I would say, spent very inefficiently. But that's because we've created a job that we're refusing to staff in a way that could make the job useful. So we have whole MECs of education in whole provinces, past MEC in KZN, who's gone on to higher office in the country, who said, why don't we just do away with all these people? In the same country in which everyone's saying, but the teachers don't know the content that they're supposed to be teaching. Why don't we do away with the only department position that's supposed to help teachers on content knowledge and pedagogical content knowledge? Under-resourcing is a severe cause of what people want to call inefficiency in the system. And I just wanted to give that example to everyone. Very briefly then, 2 and 3, the point about average effects I want to highlight, in part because I never thought about this enough in the past, right? What you said is, you can get a treatment effect, you can get the difference, you can get this effect on average, but that can hide the variation of the distribution. And for some people it did nothing, for a few it had a great effect, and for some actually it made things worse. Whether it's sending them books or biscuits or photo, whatever the thing is you want to choose, the randomistas want to test. If what you're interested in is each individual student, each individual class, and each individual school, average effects don't tell you anything. In the spirit of what you're saying at the end, right? And there's a whole body of work in literature with its own serious problems in political terms. Out of the US now, called improvement science, which is built in healthcare, but is now taken up education. And the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching of leaders here. They run a very expensive conference here, with some very good ideas because they're right about systems thinking, and some problematic parts to it. But they're saying that's what researchers do and they can do it and that's fine. It doesn't help practitioners. Because averages don't tell you what to do to help this teacher or this classroom or this school. What if this is one of the schools where this intervention is going to have a negative? Then we shouldn't be doing it here, right? And that's the difference between, so I want to highlight that point. And lastly, I want to just throw out 2 things that might be helpful if we come to where you are more hesitant, I understand why, political economy of academia, or rather sociology of knowledge, or these kinds of things. Because Lewis Gordon's book, Disciplinary Decadence, gives me 2 tools which jump out when I hear your presentation. The first is everything he argues in that book about exactly that, disciplinary decadence, about the ways in which disciplines turn in on themselves, ossify when they decide that their methodology is the only methodology that is acceptable. And I think we see that in economics, not only, we see that in economics around the world. I'm not an economist, we see it everywhere, right? We see a fetishization now within economics of particular methods, which were not always the only way to do economics. But the other beneath things is Gordon's concept of theodicy. And notion, because this is really, I think, to go back to what you were saying about why we see this now in the political economy more broadly. Theodicy is a logic, historically, of God is perfect, God is all-powerful, God is all-knowing, so what about evil? How do you explain evil? Two classic responses. Either it's because people can't understand the mind of God, or it's because God gave people free choice and it's people themselves who make the bad choices. The consequence of both, Gordon argues, is the problem is never with the system, the problem is with the people. Right? God is perfect, the people are the problem. And his argument for a long time has been there is a Theodician grammar or logic to a not post-religious, but to a world even where people have substituted scientism in some cases for God. And that's what you see. So I would just reinforce the points about missionaries, about the coloniality of all of this, and about how so much of this is deeply racist. I mean, I will close by saying, I have friends of one time from undergraduate years at UCT, you may know some of the people who won't name names, who do experiments in Western Kenya, where they give people $1,000 to say, if we give you these $1,000, will you have better aspirations? And then they have, that's the financial intervention or treatment, and then there's like a psychological treatment where we're like, we're going to run classes to teach people to have the aspirations they should have. And it's incredibly thinly veiled, saying there's nothing wrong with the system, the global capitalist system or the national political economy. The problem is just with you people who are stupid and lazy and don't think the right things. And to me, that is part of why this is so appealing, because it says you don't have to do anything structured.
Thank you very much. So the last question, and then Sean, I'll let you wrap up.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. You spoke about, you mentioned stubbornness. That was the word you used often as So I wanted to ask you your view on some of the development that has happened, especially in the African Department of Education, of introducing technology, they call it e-classes, use what you call the tablets, the board. At first it was Gauteng online. I know most of the people are familiar with it, and whereby you've had one intervention technology that was used, and then it failed dismally, everyone could see that, and then it keeps on continuing, they are adding more things, and even Banyaza Sophie is now hailed as the best MEC because of all those things. And then on the ground, everyone can see that that intervention has failed. Right. And there's no one talking about such things. Actually, what you hear is that it should spread to other provinces. Right. Once the evidence on the ground is just, and I don't know why, I don't know, it looks like everyone is silent on that issue, and even the amount of money that was spent on that intervention, I think there's 3 phases or 4 phases, something like that. So I just wanted to hear you, because I think it's some of the things that you're talking about, that would be the direct, that would be the close example of what is happening to what you mentioned.
Right, thanks. So I'm going to start actually with that question and then move back to John's comments. So again, with the caveat that I'm not an educationalist, but nevertheless I do keep track of some of these things, some of the enthusiasm for technological interventions. And economists in some instances have been responsible for sort of promoting that enthusiasm. Interestingly, in South Africa, even some of the randomistas have had to admit that these kind of technological introductions may not be a good idea. But one of the reasons why economists are often behind it is because, again, of this notion of efficiency, right? You need fewer teachers if you can replace teachers with generic classes that are given on computers, right? That's the argument. So reduce the public sector wage bill, reduce the power of the unions, introduce technology. As Bulelwa was saying earlier, in a number of instances, these technologies have been introduced in contexts where, for example, the school doesn't have electricity. Right? So this fancy technology has been rolled out, but you haven't gotten the basics right. Schools don't have electricity, they don't have sanitation. In other instances, there isn't security. Right? So there have been a number of cases where tablets and so forth have been provided and subsequently been stolen. In other instances, there are accounts where those have been provided to schools and they've immediately been locked up by the principal because the principal is scared that they're going to be stolen. So again, it's a waste of resources. So I think there are a lot of problems with that, and I think there's no evidence thus far to suggest that technology is a good substitute for building a solid education system. As much as people would like that as a shortcut, also in the context of a lot of hype around the Fourth Industrial Revolution, but there's very little evidence to support that, if any, right now. The other thing I'll just make as a brief aside on Panyaza Lusufi, I think what we're seeing is in South Africa is an evolution of politicians, where we now have politicians who are actually actively engaged in doing the kinds of things that politicians in other countries do, running after media stories and so forth, but not necessarily delivering substantively. But I think as citizens and the media, people don't actually know what to do in such situations, because at least the politician is trying and they don't seem to be stealing money. But whether that means they're delivering is, as you say, a completely different question. So just getting back to John's points. John, thanks for elaborating on all those things. I would say that I did go to some seminars by Lewis Gordon at the beginning of this year to try and broaden my intellectual horizons. And besides all the additional points you've made, all of which I would agree with, I think the one thing I should also just say is that the arguments I'm making here, people outside of economics tend to be very receptive to. The challenge that I've really tried to take on is to actually engage economists themselves. Because if you look into the history of opposition to problematic practices in economics, a lot of people understandably turn outside the discipline, because ultimately they get frustrated with the intellectual straitjacket that is placed on them. The problem, unfortunately, is the economists are exceedingly talented at ignoring people outside of the discipline, except when it suits them. So there's a lot of hype right now about collaborations between economists and psychologists, in behavioral and experimental economics, for example, but it's pretty much always on economists' own terms. Okay? So on the one hand, it's really important to engage outside of economics because the problems in economics are affecting policy decisions that will affect the future of this country for generations to come. But on the other hand, to change what economists do, you unfortunately have to engage with economists themselves on their own terms, microeconometric or otherwise. So certainly Lewis Gordon's on my reading list, and I will try and get to him. But bridging the gap also between other academics who are outside economics and really have very valuable conceptualizations of these dynamics and working in economics itself is, I would say, challenging and also a very thankless task. But thank you.
Well, thank you, Sean, once again for an excellent presentation. Thank you